Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Ankita Kumar. I am a lecturer at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, and happy Women's Day, firstly. Today we have with us on this occasion of Women's Day, I would say auspicious occasion of Women's Day, we have with us Priyadarshini Bhattacharya, who is an Indian Administrative Service Officer of the 2018 batch. This talk is actually a collaborative effort of the Journalism School of Speakers India at Berkeley, the Institute of South Asia Studies, and South Asian Journalists Association. So very grateful we have all these organizations on board. And I would like to introduce Priyadarshini to you all. She's also firstly my friend, but then she's also a very distinguished IS officer of the 2018 batch. She started a non-profit initiative called Viraam, which is actually also known as Gender Network. And she started this when she started working as an IS officer and realized that there is so much need to talk about the various injustices and forms of violence that women experience. And it's a very unique initiative because I feel that as a bureaucrat, there are lots of expectations that women are expected to conform to in the services. And Priyadarshini has always been outspoken. She's always been a person who's broken barriers for women. And I feel that the conversations she raises are very important in today's world. And apart from her work, she's also a distinguished academic. She was a gold medalist at the University of Delhi. She studied at Lady Shriram College, did her sociology honors there. Then she went to the London School of Economics as a fully funded master's scholar, and then she topped there as well. And then she secured the 66th rank in the UPSC exam, which is one of the toughest examinations in the world. So I am very grateful to know Priyadarshini and very grateful to have her here, and I will let her take over and just talk about her work. So Priyadarshini, I give you the floor.
Well, Ankita, I don't know if that elaborate introduction really, whether I'm all deserving for it or not, but there was something very personal about it. So thank you so much. I think this is one of the first introductions that I've got, which has such a personal touch to it. So thank you very much. And good morning to all of you out there. And of course, in India, it's past 10:30. And some from India have also joined in. So today is an important day for all of us here in India. We're observing Mahashivratri, as well as today is, of course, being celebrated as the International Women's Day. I'm very grateful here, and I must thank particularly UC Berkeley Journalism School and the Institute of South Asia Studies, South Asian Journalists Association, and of course, India speakers at Berkeley. So thank you so much for having me over. And it's an early morning, essentially, from that side of the world to be discussing about gender-based issues, specifically subliminal violence, which is slightly dense in theory. But nevertheless, I'll walk you through it. It's fairly simple as long as we have the basic gender tools, to navigate with. So I ideally have a PPT, but before having a PowerPoint presentation, I'd just like to tell you all a little bit about Viraam. So Viraam is an organization which is very dear to me, and it comes from a very deeply personal place. So despite, of course, being an academic in sociology and social anthropology, as well as gender, because gender was an important subject for me at the London School of Economics, as well as Lady Shriram. In fact, some of my finest professors and speakers I have met at the Delhi University, and they were extremely eloquent. And I had this particular paper. It was referred to as Sociology of Power, and Sociology of Power actually introduced me to the basic concepts of gender. So I owe a lot to my professors and to my my background, my academic background. But Viraam specifically comes from a very personal place. A dear friend of mine, Katyayani Bhatia, who's in the Indian Revenue Service, she and I basically decided to start an organization that is articulate. I don't know if vocal is the right term or not, because a lot of us are vocal about many things. But being articulate is about having the concepts right. So we wanted to specifically talk about hurt and forms of violence that are insidious, that are invisible, that are not often being given the kind of attention that it deserves. So Viram comes from, the term Viraam in Hindi essentially means where you really pause, you reflect, and you interrogate. And, being students of anthropology and sociology, it has a very close association with the concept of liminality. So, liminal, Viraam is where you take that liminal pause, you stop and you think whether what is really being considered normal is all that normal or not. And the more you think and the more you interrogate, the more answers that you come up with. So yes, of course, we'll go through all of the trajectory of Viram and what prompted it based on all your questions. And I'll be more than happy to answer the questions that come over to my end from all the students. Please, yes.
So, Priyadarshini, I'll start off by asking you why you started Viram. And
Right.
a follow-up question is, in India, a lot of times when, women talk about women's rights or feminism, feminism itself is not seen as a good term. And I want to understand why you are so vocal about this term and about gender in a society where this is practically, seen as unacceptable, or, where women are seen as problematic. So I think those questions are interconnected. So it'll be great if you can give us some insight into both.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, it's almost being kind of interpreted here as an anomaly. Why should one at all be talking about gender in a country that is not particularly receptive? But I find that statement to be slightly problematic. I'm very proud to belong to a country where some of our ancient Indian practices have in fact celebrated womanhood in many of its forms, and especially Shakti, the celebration of divine femininity. So I'm a proud Indian, and I must say that it's not an oxymoron to be talking about gender and to be talking about gender rights within the context of India. India is, of course, a bewilderingly diverse country. And after every, 500 meters, the country sort of welcomes you with a different lingo, with a different culture. So it'll be very simplistic to, in a sense, typify and generalize that this is a soil which is not particularly conducive to talking about social rights or gender rights, for that matter. Uh, Saying that, well, Viram was an initiative because, this was the reason why we kind of came up with Viram was because there was a lot of talk, and rightly so, in a lot of feminist circles about brazen forms of gender based violence, about gender based violence which are manifest, which are amenable to be seen and heard and recorded and documented. But then there were stories we realized which are undocumented and which are not necessarily making news or coming out in the open because they, for some reason, are being interpreted as either too trivial or too normal or too enmeshed with the humdrum of everyday life. So we wanted to create an organization that kind of focuses the glare on unextraordinary forms of violence, which also deserve policy attention, which also deserve legal attention, and which first and foremost deserve social attention. Because I feel going on the path of law, because that is something that I'll come to later, is slightly tricky when it comes to subliminal violence, right? Because subliminal violence is something that is uh, fairly subjective. It is how the victim survivor is actually interpreting their situation. But Viram comes from a deeply personal place because people told me why is there a need to be really talking about gender rights from where I come from? Because it is usually seen as a fairly privileged position where one has not necessarily, gone through a lot of struggles. But I found this comment to be rather obtuse to the actual social realities because violence occurs at different levels. Sometimes it is very latent and it is very low intensity and chronic. So, chronic forms of violence also deserve that kind of attention. And certain undocumented forms of violence definitely need to come out in the open. So, my entire contention is when violence is of a certain kind, specifically gender violence, is associated with a certain strata, with a certain class, or with a certain kind of social background. The unique quality about subliminal violence is that it is something that is cross cultural, cross sectional in that sense. And I had problems with the statement that we've come a long way. Uh, but I honestly see that coming a long way is something that is too presumptuous even for us to be talking about right now, because subliminal violence is something very nuanced. It operates at a very nuanced level, and I wanted to initiate discussion which was more amenable to be studying even the non-empirical. So Katyayani and I, so she's a dear friend. We used to sit together and we used to talk about, micro acts of aggression, of violence, of passive aggression as well, which could qualify as violence, that are hardly really mentioned and brought out in the fore. So a lot of us know about certain brutal acts of violence that have occurred in different parts of the country, in India, even outside, in different parts of the world. But rarely do we find people talking about, let's say, social boycott. Rarely do we find people talking about ridicule, harassment, mental harassment. Of course, now you have new terms, you have new terminologies, and thank God for that. We have terms such as gaslighting, narcissism that are being talked about openly, and they're becoming a part of our vocabulary. So this is a welcome change, and we are actually having more words included as a part of our everyday vocabulary now through our constant research that we're doing in Viraam. So we're a team of quite a few young minds from all parts of India who are coming together and creating some very fresh content which gives you a sort of a sneak peek into the lives of various women and their embodied experiences of violence. Yes, I think that was quite a long answer, but I hope I've answered some of your other questions that are to follow. But please go on, Ankita.
Yeah, I would love to keep going on, but I have one more question,
Sure,
and then
sure.
I will open the floor to my students to also ask you questions. And
Absolutely.
this question is actually from one of my students, who leads the South Asian Journalist Association at Berkeley. Her name is Tarini, and her question is, in the context of journalism, I often think about where one should place oneself in order to have maximum impact. Is it better to work outside the mainstream with the freedom to do work that we are passionate about? Or does it make more sense to work within the system of big news media, in our case as journalists, right? Despite its limitations. Given your inspiring experience both within and outside the system, I'm wondering what your thoughts on this dilemma are. It's something almost all young idealists encounter, I think. That's her question.
That's an interesting question. It's a layered question as well. It addresses a lot of things, but let's say, personally speaking, from my point of view as a bureaucrat, what I can tell you is that working within the system has its challenges, but it has its benefits as well. So I kind of see myself as a liminal bureaucrat. I'm somewhere there, I'm somewhere standing there at the threshold. And I would not consider myself to be fully and thoroughly socialized. So I'm imperfectly socialized, so to say. And I think that's a good location to be in, where you are not, an insider to anything for that matter. I prefer being an insider outsider, something that Patricia Hill Collins even mentioned in her studies on feminist studies on, she spoke about the feminist epistemology. And Patricia Hill Collins, for me, embodies in many ways my own epistemological position as a bureaucrat, as well as an academic. So, to answer your question, Tarini, working within the system uh, has its challenges, but at the same time, it has its own merits as well, because you'll be able to be a healthy critic of the things that, say, are not necessarily changing with time. You'll be able to take action if you're within the system at the same time, but you have to recognize that a system has its own pulls and pressures. So, operating within those pulls and pressures requires a bit of resilience, So inculcating resilience at an early age is also something that I would encourage for those of you who are wishing to contribute within the system. But for those outliers as well, I would say things keep moving and social forces keep changing because of outliers like you as well. So for those who want to work even outside the system, I think that may also be contemplated. So it's never an either or a zero sum game. Essentially, I decided, for me it was a very personal decision to contribute towards the development of my country by being a part of the system, by being a part of the bureaucracy. And it's been a very rewarding experience for me because I have been able to work with my fellow countrymen at the grassroots level. I have been able to engage with some local issues, which was very difficult for me when I was with the United Nations. And the United Nations, however, was a wonderful exposure for me in terms of, interacting with ambassadors of different countries and representing my country, of course, at the international level. But then it also had its limitations. I realized that a lot of, conversations that I'm having it with local NGOs, I'm having it with national governments, and I wanted to really be a part of my own government. I really wanted to be a part of my own national government and see what is it really to be on the other side of the table and to be really having those negotiations with international bodies. And so I would just say that for me, the journey as an IS officer, it's again, I'm fairly well, it's been more than 6 years, and I still have a long way to go. And there will be spaces, there will be those, interstitial spaces where you can actually make your own change, where you can create something of your own as well. So I think the healthy balance would essentially be of not letting go something that is uniquely your own as well, and not being fully conditioned by what is given to be the ideal or the norm, because whatever creates the ideal and the norm is again a lot of people, and here it's quantitative. So, not leaving your own distinct biography is very important. So, I hold on to my education, I hold on to my background, I hold on to, the kind of social conditioning that I have also experienced despite being in a system that would want me to be perfectly socialized as per their norms. So, I think holding on to your own is equally important, and of course being that observer is also important. And so I would just say, be the observer, be a critical observer, inside or out. Never give up on your ability to be critical, on your ability to be reflexive, and to constantly interrogate your own position. Yes.
I also just realized you wanted to present something about Viram, so I will let you
Yes,
present
yes. Do we
before I.
have Rahul?
Yeah.
Are you able to join in? Because I have some of my members, and Rahul has already started sharing the screen. Yes, so that's our logo of Viram essentially. It's a hug. So I don't know, it's open to interpretation essentially, but this is a warm hug, it's a warm embrace, where we are basically telling all people that we recognize your verbalization, your understanding of your own life and violence. We're not really trying to superimpose a category as to what really constitutes violence and what doesn't. So, Viram, where you stop, pause, and you recognize the symbolic and everyday workings of gender based violence. And I think a lot of our work really owes to the theorist Pierre Bourdieu. Of course, he was an exceptional French scholar, and he gave the concept of symbolic violence. And symbolic violence really gives us a lot of room to kind of look into the invisible forms of micro acts of violence and the social relations that actually uphold gender-based violence. And the concept that we come up with is subliminal violence, basically violence that is less severe, less manifest, it is low intensity, and it is of a more insidious kind. So Viram, the motto of Viram, if I really had to put it in a nutshell, it is to talk about issues that affect the well-being and the psychosocial wellness. And the terrain is a little different. The terrain is here subliminal violence, which includes not only the verbal, but the non-verbal, the behavioral, the ideological. So subliminal violence, to put it really simply, is subtle, it's hidden, it's unspoken. It's not immediately obvious because they are often, intertwined with the cultural substratum in such an intense manner that it is often not seen as problematic. But of course, they have various ramifications. They have ramifications on the psychosocial wellness of those who are experiencing such violence. Yes, let's move on now. That's, a small. These are pictures, Ankita, that I have captured during my field visits in Bengal. So I have worked in three districts of Bengal, essentially, Birbhum, Purulia, and Jalpaiguri. I'm currently in Jalpaiguri, and this is a picture from Purulia. This is about a woman, doing her everyday chores. And I had started a small project on examining a concept of subliminal violence, which was time poverty. So these are pictures from my field visits. As both a bureaucrat, of course, as an administrator, I have to go out for my field visits. I have to inspect some of the government-based schemes, but also my curiosity as an anthropologist. Next, please. Yes. So this is to give to all the viewers a very succinct way of really giving you a theoretical understanding of what subliminal violence is. So violence is a spectrum, is something that a lot of feminist scholars have spoken about. And I'm sure a lot of you might have heard about Liz Kelly. So Liz Kelly talks about the continuum of violence. And in Viraam, what we're really saying is that these are extraordinary acts of violence that often occur during post-conflict phases. Now, a lot of the human rights discourse, a lot of the journalistic news that we also get has kind of focused on the manifest cases of violence. So manifest is kind of, here on this slide at one end of the spectrum. And then again, we have latent violence. And latent violence is something that is operating at a very subtle and a subterranean level. But notwithstanding that, the continuum of violence is often seen to be a hierarchy. But this is just to tell all my viewers that subliminal violence really does not mean violence that is mild. In no way is it mild just because it is invisible and just because it is, intangible. It is very potent. It is potent and it affects people in different ways, particularly because it is accepted, it is normalized, and it is reproduced. And the reasons why these happen is due to the social indifference that also is prevalent regarding these forms of violence. This is where I mention another scholar by the name of Shaper Hughes, and she gave a very important and relevant concept about everyday violence. Shaper Hughes really talks about everyday violence, and the nature of everyday violence is that it is something so thoroughly institutionalized and normalized that even the experiencer of such violence would often see it as something very common or very trivial or something that need not really be talked about or raked up and can be easily avoided. But in Viram, what we're doing is every fortnight, we're discussing one or the other topic which is problematic, which our viewers are expressing to us in various ways. We have our viewers who are writing to us. We have an email ID, and I would love my members to essentially share the email ID with everyone. And we've been getting in a lot of views about how people verbalize, how people see violence in their own lives. And honestly, it's been a very humbling experience because you just realize that the point where feminist theory ends, something else begins. And these are real empirical experiences that people are living throughout their lives. Next, please, Rahul, if you could just change it. Okay, so this is a small section. So I have a design team in Viram, and I have Rahul with me, and I'd love him to share something because he's been designing some of our posts, which are beautiful. So we started with the color purple, essentially for Viram. So for us, purple symbolizes a certain depth, a certain profundity, and we did not really want to capture it in any of the pale colors. We wanted something richer, something deeper. And then, of course, from the purple palette, we've moved to different colors. And you'll be noticing every fortnight, whatever theme or topic we have. So, for instance, we were talking about menstrual taboos. With specific reference to India and South Asia, we were talking about the various kinds of taboos that exist within the family for girls who are menstruating. And there our color palette was a bit of black and red. It was Rakt. Our chapter was called Rakt, and Rakt is a term for blood. And our palette kind of symbolized blood which is not only red, blood which is also dirty, so-called dirty in single quotes, and it's considered so-called impure. So for us, the black and the red actually embraced a new aesthetic sensibility. Rahul, if you could just change the slide and even, tell us a little bit about the aesthetic sensibilities that really guide Viram. I have three of my members here. I have Rahul, I have Ifat, and I have Nitya. So I think now is when I invite Rahul to share a little bit because he is heading our design team. Rahul, it's please go
Hello,
ahead.
everyone. The idea behind Viram's aesthetic sensibilities has always been to, one, give voice to our members and their personal experiences, and two, using art and multimedia graphics to represent what cannot usually be represented in words alone. So we have through Viram tried to achieve that. Uh, we have frequently used a lot of abstract art as well as burgeoning artists and use their representations and perspectives uh, into Viram and into representing how we view subliminal violence as it has been a very uh, fruitful as well as enriching journey for myself personally. And I hope that all of you check out our Instagram page and uh, enjoy the posts that we have created and uh, create conversations around them. Thank you.
So just to take on from where Rahul left, it's a difficult experience, curating um, these forms of violence. I'll tell you why it is difficult aesthetically, because um, we have to be very mindful and respect the privacy of people who are sharing their stories with us. And we have to often show it in ways and mannerisms where, of course, consent is first and foremost most important to us. It is only people who, share their expression of consent that we really put up such kind of content. We even have to rely on indirect and symbolic representation of their stories, because some honestly speaking are doing it from a very personal place, and they are not yet completely in a position to be sharing it all on a public platform. So those conversations are usually in-house conversations, and those are one-to-one, those are not usually recorded. But then again, there are some who feel that they are more comfortable and they would want to kind of connect their own personal biographies to the larger social stories and to the cause. So curating those experiences is a difficult process, and it entails, the researcher's dilemma as well, or the journalist's dilemma for that case, because representation is a tricky terrain. There's also the politics of representation. I mean, how much do you represent? How much do you really disclose? How much do you show? And with what integrity can you really show it? So those are questions that we are always, facing as a team, because at the end of the day, it's about research. It's about honest research, which we are kind of bringing to the fore. Yes, let's just move on now. All right, so there are terms which we've curated that hint towards subliminal violence. These are basically a litany of terms which are now increasingly becoming more and more popular. And thank God for that. But we still have a long way to go. We still have to enrich the gender-based discourse. We still have to enrich the human rights discourse. So these are pictures that have been curated by other members of our design team to give voice to some of the terminologies. Next, please. Yes. So misrecognition is a term that, has a lot of relevance to the work of Viram, because in misrecognition, we often, when we talk to some of our victim survivors as well. Um, it's very difficult for them initially to come to terms with the fact that what is occurring is also violence. So I spoke about cultural and social conditioning initially. And sometimes it is very difficult to, have them accept the fact that something really wrong has happened, because they usually tend to view it as a part of the status quo, something that is perfectly objective and normal. So misrecognition was a term that kept coming up, during our process of research and during our kind of sharing the stories. Interruption, of course, is now a common term. So interruption, of course, while being a generic term, is also a gender sensitive term. So a lot of cases, women have actually written to us where they've kind of told us that during even conversations, the frequency of interruption that they're experiencing is much more compared to what men experience in their conversations with, let's say, even their equals for that matter, positionally. So yes, these are some of the terms that we as a team were curating. Next, please. All right, and these are some questions that we had prepared for a workshop. So we also, as a team, conduct workshops for different platforms. We have a certain section of case studies that shall also be presented after these questions. So case studies that actually nudge you to thinking whether what is happening with the victim survivor is all that normal or not. So right after this, I think we have our case studies. Next, please. All right. And these are pictographic ways of making certain concepts more easy to our audience. These are the perils of misrecognition. And, we're talking about the fact that the more you realize that you are actually facing or suffering subliminal violence, the better is your road to recovery. And the fact that subliminal violence is preventable, it is detectable, and it isn't something that needs to be shrouded by discourse. Next, please. These are a few more words. We can keep going on, and the next slides are, of course, we can go through these words. A lot of these have become common. These are pictures from different parts of India. So I have done my case study in Haryana as well, and I was working on the issue of honor-based crimes in India, and I've even published a paper which talks about honor-based crimes in Haryana and my experience as a researcher in Haryana. And in my analysis of honor-based crimes, I was also focusing on the social boycott of the woman and of the entire couple that usually precedes the last act, which is the manifest act. Next, please. So we have kind of, suggested here a toolkit, which of course is not exhaustive. There are a lot of concepts that we've given in this toolkit, but we'll arrive at that only later, maybe towards the later part of this conversation. And now I won't keep you all up. In case of any further questions, Ankita, please feel free to pose. I think Cecile is here as well, and I'm sure you might be having some more questions. The toolkit is only for later. Maybe let's say when we have another conversation with Berkeley, we'd be more than happy to present the toolkit and also present a few case studies from India.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, I let Cecile take over. So I know she has a lot of interesting questions. So
Yes,
Cecile,
absolutely,
feel free to take
absolutely.
over. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Priya. It's a very pretty detailed presentation you have there, the slides. And very importantly, I just looked through your Instagram page and I see it's very
Right.
pictorial. And young ladies, young people of this age, they live on their social media. So it's good that, and they like everything visual. So putting artistic representation, graphics like that, it's really interesting. I have a few questions before we start asking the general questions. Meanwhile, I would like to ask everyone to please use the Q&A to drop your questions. Whatever you would like Priya to ask, please do drop your questions. So quickly, I have a number of questions here, but I'll try to take just a few so that we can open up the floor. When you talk about this subliminal, that is subtle violence in workplace. How can one differentiate between cultural practice and subtle violence, especially in a patriarchal, in a male-dominated society? So how can you get to separate this so that you're not insulting the cultural sensitivities? You can give examples, actual examples or instances to actually drive home the point.
Absolutely. I think that's a very beautiful question, Cecile, because this is a complicated area. So a lot of aspects, let's say, that may qualify as subliminal violence, maybe they're so culturally enmeshed that it is very difficult to kind of separate the two, which is really a cultural practice and which is really an act of subliminal violence. So I feel that this is for the victim survivor to decide also. The power also has to come from their own voices, kind of determining or superimposing a category of violence for them. I think would in itself be a gross simplification and an act of violence on my part. So we have come a long way, actually, Cecil. Even our human rights discourse, the CEDAW, in its general recommendations 19 defines violence as any act that has the potential to cause hurt, harm at various levels, at the psychological level, at the emotional level, at the economic financial level, and at the social level. So I think we'll have to develop certain standards to draw the line of what really qualifies as violence and what really qualifies as a cultural practice. To be honest, oftentimes it is seen that in the garb and in the veneer of culture, a lot of practices continue with a lot of impunity. So culture is often a refuge also for certain acts to continue in an institutionalized manner with impunity. So I think what is important is to create a more participatory environment where it is not only a few academics or a few policymakers or a few human rights practitioners who decide what truly qualifies as culture and what qualifies as violence, but a more participatory environment where the stakeholders include women themselves who are experiencing these forms of violence and who are in a position to interrogate with respect to what has happened to them and their lives. So we have actually, Cecil, come a long way from some of the practices that used to even perpetuate gender inequality. We had a horrific practice called sati. I don't know if you've heard about it, but sati is where a woman would actually burn herself in the funeral pyre of her husband. So we even have many other practices that were actually touted as culture, but caused and inflicted a lot of harm and a lot of damage. There are also certain areas, certain pockets that we see in India that certain discriminatory practices on the basis of caste and ethnicity still perpetuate, still continue. But then again, we have a very vibrant civil society and we have constitutional protection against these forms of discrimination, against these forms of violence. So, Cecil, honestly, things are work in progress. We have come a long way, but we also have to go further. And the recent paper that I'm working on is about enriching and further, expanding the contours of the human rights discourse. So the human rights discourse, it's been a boon to all of us because it has kind of, delineated the contours of violence. And that has been a result of years of movement, years of, women's and gender-based activism. But now I feel that there has to be a lot of more work that needs to be done around these nuanced and subtle forms of violence. So we even experience the Bengal Renaissance. So I am currently posted in West Bengal, and I'm proud to say that this was one of the first few states that experienced the Bengal Renaissance, where this was a movement of intellectual creativity and critical reflections on our existing social practices. So we've had a history of social reformers in India and also specifically in Bengal, who have interrogated these ancient practices that were often given the name of tradition and culture. But those over time have been critiqued, those over time have been done away with. And we have very progressive legislations now in India that, kind of coming into the fore and rescuing these people who are still subject to these anachronistic practices. So we have, the Domestic Violence Act, protection against domestic violence. We have this Protection Against Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act. We have what is known as the Vishaka Guidelines. So we have a host of legal measures, Cecil, in our country. But what is important at the end of the day is there must be a constant social churning. There must be a constant debate about the new and the shifting boundaries of violence. And that must not remain static, I feel. So I think that's a beautiful question that you've raised. And, not all culture is harmful. In fact, culture is something that keeps alive our collective memory, and it is something that we nurture. But culture at the same time cannot ossify over time. It has to change. It is dynamic. It is something that's vibrant. It has also to be receptive to the existing social forces. So culture is something beautiful if considered so, and if made to be used in the right direction. So thank you so much for that question, because that's something that I'm really engaging with in my current paper.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that pretty detailed response. You should be in the classroom, a professor like Ankit. Alicia has a question, but Alicia, please give me a moment. Let me quickly add to this. When you're talking about this subtle violence, a friend of mine talked about her sister who is in a workplace as she experienced some kind of sexual violence. Of course, the expected thing to do is to report it to the authorities, which she did. They set up a committee of 6, made up of 5 men and 1 woman. And of course, she lost her case. She couldn't, so she felt really bad and felt like, who am I going to report this to? And that leads me to another, question, to my next question, which is, sometimes just subtle violence in workplaces happen, but these women cannot speak because that is their only source of livelihood. They are intimidated, so they just get to live with it. How do you advise that people like that can get around it? I mean, she has children. She's the breadwinner, for instance, but she cannot go to complain because that is her only source of livelihood. And it's subtle. And they'll tell you that, but he didn't do anything, so why are you complaining? So if you can answer that very quickly, and then we'll take Alicia's questions and the others.
Sure, sure. So coming to your first response of that particular experience, of women's representation, of the committee having 1 woman representative and other men. So women's representation does not always necessarily secure gender justice as well. I think that's where we really have to come in and talk about more than just, of course, a tokenistic representation. What's important is a thorough gender-based education and a certain understanding of what gender is and what power is. So for that matter, even for that matter, had it been, a committee with all male members, it could have still been a gender just decision. This is not to say that men are not capable of making gender just decisions. So yes, that's just a quick response to the case study that you gave me. But when you say that these kind of complaints are often, not shared because of the fact that it's often difficult to share something that is so subtle. I think more importantly, more than, of course, institutionalizing and creating proper forums in a workplace to discuss these issues, there have to be certain social measures also. So in Viraam, what we're really talking about is that before any legal measures can be introduced for addressing subliminal and symbolic violence, there have to be institutionalized social procedures. And I think, the Sexual Workplace Act here in India, we have the Concept Act of an internal complaints committee. We have an ICC, which is present in every office which is ideally supposed to be, legally speaking, a part of every workplace, an internal complaints committee. But then again, the concept of some symbolic and subtle violence is something that is not completely known to people. So educating them and informing them about such forms of violence is an imperative at all fronts. And creating a sort of a forum which involves, women sharing their stories and creating a certain solidarity is very much the need of the hour before we turn into the legal measures, because legal measures are going to be slightly more complicated, to be very honest with you, Cecile. Legal measures are going to take time because subtle violence is a highly subjective area, right? But this is not to take away the potency and the reality of violence. But the first and the most immediate measures have to be social. And social measures will only happen if you raise, your voice and you talk about these forms of violence in a conducive atmosphere. So for creating a conducive atmosphere, it's very important that you have a community of practitioners. You have a community of feminist practitioners. And in fact, I'll be introducing the term right now. It's called feminist praxis. So that is something that I constantly talk about in my paper. No matter which background you come from, no matter which post you're heading, a certain degree of awareness and education in feminist praxis is the need of the hour. Having a community of listeners in any workplace, or even for that matter, even in an informal or a we have a lot of unorganized sector as well as in India. So having a committee of listeners in the form of a community of feminist practitioners in a workplace setting is very important. And having an internal complaints committee in a workplace is very important, where you even take into consideration these forms of subtle violence. For instance, voyeurism for the largest time in India was not a part of the Indian Penal Code. But now voyeurism is, of course, something that is considered to be, as a part of sexual harassment. So, expanding the concept of sexual violence, expanding the concept of gender based violence is only going to happen when there is a healthy amount of sharing of stories that takes place. Only with sharing would there be a certain change at the policy level. Because all of this, Cecile, to be very honest with you, policy has to basically consider the importance of symbolic violence. Unless and until policy really realizes and recognizes what symbolic violence is, it is very difficult to have any legal and institutional change. So for that to happen, discussion, debate, constant reflection is very important. And for that, we need to have some initiators.
All right, thank you very much for that question. I have a few more, but I'll let Alicia take a couple of questions and then we'll get back
If
to
you
you.
could just let me, Cecil, I have two more members of Viraam. I think I have Ifat here. She might want to say something. Ifat is a very dear member of Viraam, and I'd love to give her, a minute to just possibly share her experience.
Sure.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hello. It's glad that I'm a part of this. It's lovely to hear everyone, and the questions are wonderful, I must say. So, coming back to Viram and why exactly it was started, we have already come across all the ideas and the points and the genesis, technically, right? Like it means stop, to stop and reflect. Stop and reflect what, right? That's the next question. So, it's the idea of the subliminal, the intrusions that we face in our everyday life. Now, for me, when I had initially joined Viram, it was pretty new for me because I never questioned, to be very honest. But when I went onto Instagram and I checked the page and I started figuring out, okay, these are the questions that might be important. These are the questions that are very important for me as an individual at a workspace, what I am facing. I need to reflect on those ideas. And slowly and steadily, I realized that many of the things which I was uncomfortable about, I could I could speak about it. I could raise my voice and I could come up and share those ideas. So I think in a way, Viram not only helps people to understand and reflect, it also brings a certain amount of confidence. It gives you the courage to recognize and speak up. So that has been my experience in Viram, and I'm sure many of us have faced it too. And being a part of this family itself gives us the boost to help each other and everyone around. Yes.
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much. I like the fact that you call it a family. Priya, you want to
Yes.
add anything before Alicia comes up?
Yes, please. I think what Ifat's mentioning is very important. You know, Cecil, it's very important to create a social vocabulary for violence. And often there's a dearth of words. It's very difficult to explain to someone that, you know, this is causing me pain, this is problematic, this is not acceptable. And, you know, so in my paper, I talk about the anthropology of violence and the anthropology of speech. So we often rely on speech, right, to understand about the experience of violence. But speech in itself can be very difficult to comprehend for survivors who go through acute, chronic, and low intensity violence. For them to really explicate their pain is putting them in a very difficult position. It is difficult because, you know, there are a complex of emotions. It's a very layered experience, especially when you say that you have no bruises to show, essentially, but at the same time, you're emotionally wounded, you're bruised. So we have even been talking to people at different levels, and I've conducted a study in Jalpaiguri. I've been working with the tea garden workers here, and it's been a humbling experience because a lot of these ladies come from a tribal background. We refer to them here as Adivasis, and they have been recounting their stories of neglect, gender neglect and gender maltreatment at the hands of their partners and husbands. And they have given me a host of new concepts to think with. They talk about laparwahi. Laparwahi is neglect, and laparwahi for them is an important indicator of violence. So those are about your acts of omission as well, which qualify for violence. And the more I speak to them, I realize that their vocabulary is rich. Their vocabulary has a lot of symbolism, which sometimes even maybe the English language will be difficult to understand. For English structural semantics, it'll be very difficult to understand some of the very culturally coded concepts that they come up with. And these culturally coded concepts are important to listen to and hear. I have even been working with, tribal Santhal women in Purulia, where they have spoken about how they suppress their hunger, to subscribe to notions of feminine modesty and femininity. And that for me is, of course, violence because you're thwarting what is your natural biological process. I have been, privy to the controlling tactics that men employ to control the financial strings of their women, and the kind of financial neglect that is also happening in the tea gardens. So they have kind of, these case studies have opened up a new world of experience for me, which, contemporary feminist studies, some of them, of course, are very vivid. Some of them come close to understanding the embodied experience of violence. But for the rest of it, I still find that, we have to really go a long way to capture these very unique experiences of women who are located in a particular socio-cultural stratum. They are revealing their intersectional experiences. So gender is, of course, a very fluid concept. It even conflates with other identity markers, right? So there's ethnicity, there's language, there's caste, there's so much. And when you find gender at a crossroads with other identities, the experience may be completely unique. So being receptive to such unique experiences, I feel is very important.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Alicia.
Yes. Hi, I think your talk has been so inspiring, especially on this day. I definitely feel more empowered as a woman. So thank you so much for everything that you've shared so far. I just had a question, like a very simple question that I think in India, especially women were considered to be the lower, inferior than men. I think we've always seen like how women have always been treated as just home workers, and like I think women have not been given that much respect as they're given now in terms of equality and stuff. So how do you think that like do you think that in this day, age, and time, like there has been a change in terms of how women are being treated, or have they been viewed? And do you think crime rates towards women have decreased? And if not, or like if that's not what it is right now, what do you think are certain measures that us as a whole, or us as like powerful women can take to reduce all of that and to spread more awareness and to bring other women up? Like, how do we uplift our own kind?
Thank you, Alicia, for the question. Uh, I can just say that I'm a very proud Indian citizen, and I'm proud of my, culture and tradition. We're a country that has always celebrated womanhood, and in fact, the Devi is a very important symbol of feminine strength. So, being seen as second class citizens is something that I feel is sadly a picture, a representation of India, but I don't know why should that be so. And I would really want my audience to, even including myself, there's so much to read about our great ancient texts. But suffice to say is that I come from a country where women are respected at all levels. And in fact, my mother was a homemaker. And, we're a country which is very proud of having women being represented at different levels. I am presently an additional district magistrate in my district. I have my district magistrate who's a lady. I have my CM who's a lady. And all of us are doing a lot of good work in different parts of life. So today, in fact, the police administration also celebrated the the Women's Day, the International Women's Day, and they were talking about the ILO motto. So I'm quite, surprised whenever I hear about India's representation at different levels, about being a country that is not particularly conducive to gender rights. Uh, Saying that, of course, there have been some disturbing episodes also in the recent past. And the crime rates in different parts of India, of course, the crime rates have, they're not showing any abatement. But at the same time, I do believe that the fact that crimes are being reported and recorded is also something that is important and telling of the current social environment, that people are willing to go out there and report a crime. I was a part of the Indian Police Service, and during my training as an IPS officer, I realized that our system does provide all its women equal access and opportunity as is provided to men. But then again, there are certain structural inequalities that exist in every society. And in India, too, there are certain structural inequalities, but I would not make this a thing of culture and tradition as much as I would do with the socio-cultural and the socio-structural arrangement. So that's a different debate. I would not attribute gender inequality to my culture. I could attribute it definitely to the existing structural conditions, and that is a much more nuanced debate that deems an entire separate discussion, I feel. But I can just say, as a bureaucrat and a citizen of my country, that we're doing good work in different parts. In different states, we also have a host of social schemes that are now focusing on mental well-being, psychological health, and the social rights of women. We've come a long way from just discussing about civil and political rights. We are now talking about social rights of women. And I'm very proud to say that I am, a bureaucrat in a state where we consider every woman here as a Lakshmi. And we are having the Lakshmi Bhandar scheme, for women from the age group of 25 to 60. We have various government benefits for women of different age spans. So, this sort of a juxtaposition of gender backwardness with India is something that I would really like to address. And I would also like to point it out that this is not really a cultural condition, but definitely a structural condition. But we are getting there. We are now having representation and reservation of women in our panchayats. In fact, a lot of our lady pradhans and those who are heading the panchayat samitis are women, and they are wholeheartedly participating in local governance and in local rural development. So I have a lot of things to essentially be proud of. And those things which I'm not particularly proud of, I will be working as a bureaucrat to make certain things at least better for the other citizens. And I'm sure other people like me too would be doing their bit.
Priya, I just want to add a point here.
Yes.
I see these changes very much in my own home. Like for example, yesterday, my mom, who is not, who's pretty much an introvert, just turned around and told her own mother that, you have treated me as an inferior person for a long time, and now I will not, accept any form of, discrimination or manipulation, and I will do what I think is right. And I think for her to say that and, just realize that she has her own freedom itself showcases how far we have come as a country. Because in my mom's time, it was acceptable to, not speak up against, your husband, or not say anything against your in-laws. But now women are realizing that we have the freedom to do what we want to do, and it's not always tied to financial freedom. It's we are free individuals with our own thoughts, and
Absolutely.
it's not wrong to cite our thoughts. Yeah.
And in fact, Ankita, journalism, our media here has played a very pivotal role. So has our civil society. The films that we are seeing, the books that we are reading, the social media that we are exposed to, the artists and the story writers, they are now weaving new narratives. And all of us are privy now to those narratives. We're listening to new stories, fresher stories, more unconventional stories. And I think a great platform to be learning from each other is also by listening to each other's stories. So Viram also offers that platform, and I'm very happy to see that there are a lot of, feminist circles within India who are really pushing the bar, and they're really bringing some very important conversations in the fore. So I'm very sanguine. In fact, I'm very hopeful of us and even for the coming generation. Of course, the social aberrations that we are seeing, the anomalies that we are seeing, they also need to be dealt with very firmly by the existing legal system. And there's always scope for improvement. There's no denying there. We have to get better and better. But the way to do that would also be to have a certain degree of, pride in one's past, with, of course, humility to better the future.
All right. Thank you very much. Ankita, are you good? Do you want to ask another questions or I take over?
No, you can take over. Yeah.
Okay, okay. All right. Now I'd like to tell you about something I have been reading up and something I'm a little passionate about, and that is maternal and child health in rural India. Now,
Yes.
specifically, I would like to talk about postpartum depression. Of course, we know those in the urban areas, they have access to resources, facilities like that. But those in rural communities, they very likely may not have all that support. Family support, family supports, husband. I'll give you some instance. I say this because I'm from Nigeria, and there are some rural communities in Nigeria where we've seen women go through postpartum. The people don't understand it. They think she's
Yes.
cursed. They think there's a problem. Even the mother or a mother tells you that I didn't go through all this when I was young. I mean, so what's wrong with you? Stuff like that. You want to comment about it very quickly and briefly. And if there are instances you'd like to give us, I like stories. So if there are stories you want to share to drive on the point, please tell us.
Cecile, this is a very important point that you're raising about postpartum depression because, we have a lot of primary health centers and health centers operating in the rural areas. And we have, frontline workers who are known as ASHA workers. So, ASHA basically are accredited social health activists. And they are operating in India. They are frontline workers who have been given basic training with respect to women's health and reproductive health care. But postpartum depression is something that really needs to have a place in the rural areas. It is, of course, something that is being much talked about in the urban areas. A lot of celebrities have also, from the Indian film fraternity, brought it to the fore. A lot of academics and scholars are talking about it. But postpartum depression requires a deeper and a more meaningful conversation in the rural areas. So, Cecil, and this is where I see the relevance of us as an organization and as a community. Depression is a very important aspect, and especially postpartum depression has a lot of socio-cultural connotations as well. And we often see mental well-being as something that is purely psychological. We often frame it as a psychological thing, right? That if it's mental well-being, it's within the ambit of psychology. But I would go a step ahead in saying that it is as much a matter of the social sciences and sociology as much as it is the preserve of psychology, because there are a lot of ideologies and cultural ideologies around postpartum depression and depression. It is seen as often an anomaly. It is seen as often something that need not really be discussed about or talked about, and it's something that the woman can cope up with. She can handle it by herself if she has the support of her family, and it's very normal to feel what you're feeling. So there has to be a more deeper advocacy at the rural areas. And I feel that our ASHA workers really need to be trained with respect to mental well-being and psychological well-being as well. Because our health systems, our local rural health systems tend to be too much centered around, just antenatal care and of course the delivery of the child. But what after the delivery of the child? Those are the kind of conversations that we really need to be having. So thank you so much for raising this issue. There is much to be done with respect to postpartum depression, especially for the rural areas here in India, and maybe we can start newer conversations around this.
Yeah, that would be nice. I think working with media, whatever media, print, broadcasts, making some little content out there in the language of
Absolutely.
people would actually help. And Kita, why you say something?
Yeah, I was just saying that Priya, I know we are almost at time, but there's a question from someone who's asking how can we help with Viram's mission and maybe even
All
get
right.
involved. So if you can touch upon that, that'll be great.
That's a very helpful question at this point, honestly, because we're trying to, kind of expand our community. We referred to ourselves as a family just a while ago, but we're a small family, and we'd like, members from different backgrounds join us, because, we are firmly of the opinion that we want a more diverse body with us. We want people who come from different cultures and share different, ideas about even how we should go ahead. So ideally, if you want to join Viram, you'll have to write to us at viramipv@gmail.com. So it's VIRAAMIPV. Initially, we were focusing on the ambit of, interpersonal violence. So ipv@gmail.com, and please write to me, because I'll be getting in touch with you. And we'd like to see in which projects could we really get you involved. So we have, a content team, which is constantly focusing on creating, generating new content and doing a bit of research as well, and research around a variety of topics. So, we've been focusing on time poverty, concepts such as time poverty. We've been focusing on menstrual taboos. We've been focusing on equal work for equal pay, and we've been focusing on a host of issues, basically. So we would like to give you a certain project and see how better you can collaborate and what kind of content or research you could do for us, so we could have the content out there and we could even initiate a workshop with you. So ideally, you'll just have to start following us on Instagram, write to us so that we can see where exactly can we fit you within the Viram family, because we have a thriving design community, we have a content community, we have a research community, and we have, a public, sort of a PR community as well, which does all the outreach and all the work in collaboration with other feminist organizations. So please feel free to write to me, and you could even personally, message me. I'd be more than willing to listen to you from your stories and maybe your own circles.
Okay, I think with that comment and with that contributions and with that interest of trying to help out in what you do, I think is a good place to wrap it up. We've taken quite a lot of your time. I know you are very busy, and
No, not at all. It's just getting a little late. That's all.
oh yes, yeah, it's fine. We would let you get
No,
on
no,
to other
today
things.
actually, Cecil, just on a lighter note, it's Mahashivratri, and I plan to now sit for my meditation. So
Ah,
yes, it's just about to be midnight, and I do a few practices as well. So I'll just
mm,
be sitting now after the conversation, which is why I think we'll
okay.
call it today. But I'll be more than happy to conduct another workshop where we actually discuss a few case studies. We discuss about the kind of work that we've done in different parts and about my experience as a bureaucrat.
It's okay, and we'll share these videos, and if there are more questions or concerns that pop up, we'll sure get Ankita to email you the questions, and hopefully having another of our fora. Thank you.
Absolutely, that'll be wonderful.
All right, thank you.